This is the webinar Global Agriculture in Crisis, Envisioning a Just Transition. My name is Katie Sandwell. I'll be co-facilitating together with my colleague Farouk Tariq. I work with the Transnational Institute. I'm also part of the Food Sovereignty Resource Justice cluster of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, who have organized this webinar today. So AEPF, as you may know, is a network of CSOs and social movements across Asia and Europe, working on pro-people alternatives that challenge economic, social, and political hegemonies. AEPF works for ecologically just and sustainable policies, and its bi-yearly People's Forum provide input into the official Europe-Asia Heads of State meeting. We're linked with hundreds of movements across 40 countries in Asia and Europe, and I hope that some of you joining today are from those movements. Welcome to our new series of webinars, which is addressing different dimensions of the current crisis. I'm very pleased to say that the webinar today is interpreted into both Urdu and Bahasa. So many thanks to our interpreters, Rati Sukma and Farouk Valeria, for agreeing to interpret for us today. And I will do my best to speak slowly. Please wave your arms when I inevitably speed up. And just to let you know, if you wish to use the interpretation function, you should see a little image of a globe at the bottom of your screen, and you can select your language there. However, unfortunately, Zoom gives us only a limited list of languages. So for Urdu, I would ask you please to choose the language Russian, and for Bahasa to choose Chinese. And we'll also put that information in the chat for you. So we're going to start today, just to let you know about the format, by hearing from our speakers in 2 rounds of interventions. And we've been very hard on them and asked them to be very brief in their interventions. So they will do 1 quick round of all 4 presenters. We'll then go back around for a second brief round with all of them. And my co-facilitator, Farouk, will then pose some questions. And you can pose those questions yourself in the Q&A. And Farouk will then gather those and present them at the end of the session to the facilitators. So you'll see we have a chat box in addition to the Q&A. The chat you're really welcome to use throughout, as I see some of you already have, to introduce yourself, to share some thoughts and insights as we go along. But if you wish to pose a question to the speakers, I would ask you please to use the Q&A function for that so that we can organize them. If you're on Twitter, if you're active on Twitter or Facebook or other social media, we also invite you to engage there. And we'll be using the hashtag AEPF webinars. That will also be in the chat. So please feel free to share your thoughts that way. And just to say finally that our time is quite short, so I'm afraid we're unlikely to get to all of your questions. But please do go ahead, share your thoughts and your questions with us, and we'll also take those into consideration when we're considering the future workshops and activities to do. So they will not be forgotten, even if they are not asked directly to the speakers. So with that said, I don't want to take any more of our precious time, but I'll move on to introducing our speakers now. I'll introduce each speaker as we go along, and we'll be starting today with Sandeep Chachra. Sandeep is a social anthropologist by training, and he serves as the executive director of Actionaid Association. He's joining us today from India, and he's the managing editor also of Agrarian South, a leading journal of labor and agrarian political economy. Sandeep also co-chairs the World Urban Campaign of UN Habitat. Welcome, Sandeep. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please go ahead. Sandeep, you are muted.
Hi, warm welcome to everybody. Greetings to all. Namaste, salam to everybody who's connected today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Honored to be here with Asia-Europe People's Forum. I'm a part also of the Resource Justice Cluster, like Katie has just mentioned. And thank you, Katie, for giving a message that you'll be very strict on time and you're not counting as of now, I understand. Friends, since I'm the first speaker, I will try and I do it slowly for the ease of translators. I'll try and lay out the issue as I look at it in terms of the question that is on the table today, the global crisis of agriculture and envisioning a just transition. So in the round 1, I'll focus on the question of the crisis itself. Now, to me, we know that over 3 billion people of our planet, around half or slightly less than half, numbers keep dropping, people who can be called as dependent on agriculture. including the families, of course. So to me, this is a question of, and why it's important, it's a question of the people of our planet, and it's indeed the question of the planet itself. Friends, as we know, if we want to analyze agriculture today, we see two very broad trends. The bigger and the more important trend of what one can call and what we call peasant agricultures, which employs or which gives home to roughly about 2.5 billion people or there around. Once again, numbers fluctuating, just to give you the trends. And on the other hand, a smaller but over the last 5 decades, a surely growing trend of what's called industrial agriculture, agriculture submitted to the capitalist logic or to the logic of capital, which is home to roughly around 500 million to somewhere between 1 billion people. But as I said, growing. Now, we all know that peasant agriculture is also not one, and the world of agriculture is not one monolithic idea or model of agriculture. So indeed, peasant agricultures, for the ease of convenience, is home to a very diverse types of agricultures, or let me call it peasant agricultures, in different ecosystems, in different zones of the world with different practices. But there are broad characteristics which we all know about. Labor intensive it is, subsistence oriented it is. One can say it has more drudgery in it. Given the levels of technology employed in peasant agricultures around the world, more predominant in the global south for historic reasons. One can go in more detail. But obviously, one other very important feature, it offers to the people employed in that agriculture a lot of autonomy, a lot of decision-making autonomy, a lot of autonomy over what they grow, and therefore control over what they grow and what they eat. So in some ways, providing that kind of surety to people employed in that agriculture. And needless to say, these are in the modern day language called smallholder agriculture or smallholder farming, given the size of land tenures and land holdings. And there are lots of issues within that as well. So this on one hand. On the other hand, you have the trajectory of what's called agriculture to the industrial or capital logic, and agriculture which is growing surely, represented much more by a hegemonic tendency of one type of cropping. One can say tendencies around monocropping, tendencies around a particular type of agriculture, highly input oriented, less labor intensive, if one may call it, with higher levels of mechanization and so on and so forth. In some ways, monocultures and of course, needless to say, submitted surely and securely within the logic of the capital, which is the logic of accumulation and super accumulation at that level. Now, if one were to sort of see the global sort of tendency of the last 50 years and increasingly intensified, one sees a sure shift away from peasant agricultures into the submission of agriculture to industrial and capital logic. This has been the tendency on the one hand, and needless to say, this represents on the other hand, in all our countries in the global south in particular, but also in the global north. For one cannot say Europe is post-agricultural in that sense. A starvation of peasant agricultures by various means. A starvation of peasant agriculture has meant lack of state support and subsidy to those in the peasant agriculture on the one hand, and an extensive subsidy to those in corporate agriculture and companies or individuals within of those corporate industrial agriculture. Starvation has meant lack of extension, lack of diverse kind of researches. So all of that the state support construes into the sector called agriculture. But on the other hand, starvation has also meant the added dimension of land grabs, massive land grabs in the south, across Africa, across Asia, across Latin America, and also increasingly in parts of Europe and North America. Land grabs which take away land in the name of acquisition, in the name of development, in the name of modern projects, away from the control of peasantry. But that's just the second feature. The third feature is an unwillingness to address the historic questions of agriculture, which has ailed agriculture. Peasant agriculture, particularly in Asia, is also characterized by extensive smallholding farming, but also of landlessness. So in inability and an unwillingness to address the unfinished agenda of land reforms lies at the heart of continued ignorance and starvation of the idea of peasant agriculture itself. Now, this happens in a logic where in the South, I can speak for India, but I can generalize it across, is an intent that the South must catch up with the North. And the way to do it is to follow what North did 2 centuries ago in the agrarian transformations, in the agricultural transitions, and which is essentially to consolidate land holdings and increasingly go towards industrial agriculture. Now, this has 2 or 3 important facets, and I'll hurry up in this regard. The first is it means that surplus people will be created as surpluses, and people will need to be expelled from the arena called agriculture into another uncertain arena. Historically, in Europe, this meant that surplus populations in agriculture, or expelled populations in agriculture, found home into labor-intensive industrialization 200 years ago, as what happened in Europe, in particular, Germany or UK, or in the one instance, and in the second instance, export of populations, which meant that under the aegis of colonialism, Europe was in particular able to export surplus populations into the indigenous lands of North America, into settler colonialism in Africa, into settler colonies into Asia, as well as in Latin America. Now, these 2 tendencies are historically repeatable in a sense. At a time when industrialization is no longer labor intensive, at a time where, in fact, if you study in our countries, the labor absorption into industries, that has been falling consistently over the past 3 decades. So it has led to a situation of creation of precarious people in what is now called informal economy, in a space where people have virtually no protection, no social protection, hardly any labor rights, and obviously lesser said the better about wages, in terms of wage protections, in terms of dignity of wages, and so on and so forth. So essentially, transferring what was peasant agriculture into an arena of uncertainty, into making of surplus, Marx would call it something else, additionally, into making of people who can be called precarious people. Some people call it the everywhere, nowhere people, who are everywhere in quest for work, in search for work, and nowhere because they are really nowhere in terms of their own futures. So in some ways, this is the 2.5 billion people of our planet, which are today by ILO standards called the informal workers of the world. And I think this continuum needs to be understood. And I'm going to stop here in terms of identifying the issues. And this, to me, is representing where we stand today, not just the crisis of agriculture, but the crisis of the planet itself. But one can argue that this historic impossibility, where the South cannot recreate what the transitions in agriculture were in the North 200 years ago, for reasons I have said, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the model of industrial agriculture is nothing but an ecological dead end. So it construes both a historic impossibility and an ecological dead end at the same time. I'll come back in my round 2 about trying to examine a little bit more on what this ecological dead end is and what therefore needs to be done at the moment to reverse and to protect our planet, but centrally to protect our people in that destiny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. Thank you for that excellent political orientation and introduction. I would like, and I'm sorry to be very strict with the time, and we will indeed come back to you for some more comments in the second round. So I would like now to introduce Dr. Yandawa Vanderplur. Yandawa, thank you very much for joining us. Yandawa is joining today from the Netherlands. He is an emeritus professor of rural sociology at Wageningen University, as well as an adjunct professor of rural sociology at the College of Humanities and Development Studies of China Agricultural University in Beijing. Yandawa has also acted as a member of the Dutch Council of the Rural Areas, an advisor to the European Commission and to the Italian Minister of Agriculture. Thank you very much for joining us, Yandawa. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Katie, and good morning to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I don't know. Anyway, very welcome, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Okay, we all know that the current COVID-19 crisis is not just a medical crisis. As a matter of fact, within a few days, within a week, the biomedical crisis turned into a very widespread, very deep, comprehensive political economic crisis. You could argue that the current crisis is having deep structural causes that are related with global capitalism. And when it comes to food and agriculture, it can be argued that the COVID-19 pandemic just deepened the already existing crisis. What we are witnessing today are, on the level of the economy, consequences like an overall reduction of gross domestic production of some 20% or even higher levels. So poverty worldwide is increasing. At the same time, there is a massive increase in unemployment everywhere in the global north and the global south. And this translates in many parts into dramatic return to the countryside. For many people, poor people, it's the last resort that allows them to defend their level, even at the very high levels of precariousness. The crisis also has brought a reduction in food production and an associating rise in food prices, which affects negatively, especially the poor people all around the world. And then, of course, there have been massive interventions into the agro-food system, especially in the global north, to mitigate some of these consequences. Therefore, billions of euros and dollars have been invested to mitigate the problems. But this just means that these problems are, as it were, transported to the future. There will be huge debts to be paid for in the years to come, so extending the crisis into the future. Now, all these economic effects, you will understand, are not directly caused by COVID-19. It is precisely the interaction between the pandemic on the one hand and the political-economic context on the other hand. You could argue that COVID-19 showed in a merciless way the major weaknesses of our agro-food systems as they are organized currently in global capitalism. I will point to 4 of these weaknesses. First of all, nearly all agro systems in the world are export oriented. During the neoliberal epoch, export policies became dominant, and most, you can see it in the statistics, nearly all agricultural systems in the world are now oriented at exports, and our food, wherever we are, is partly coming in an increasing part from imports. Now, this comes with huge international webs for the distribution and transport of food and for food ingredients. And all this fell flat totally when with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. A second reason is the huge financialization of the food production, food processing, and food distribution. Let me just give one example, just one out of the many. For international trade, it's huge volumes, you need credits. Now, to obtain this credit, you need to have an assurance that if there are problems, the credit will be paid back anyway to the bank. Now, what happened as soon as there was this outbreak of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, the large capital groups that assure these credit assurances, that organize these credit assurances, withdraw from the market. Yeah, so this means being dependent on capital is a major weakness, because capital withdraws in view of the risk that comes with COVID, and it all falls flat. Now, you have the same financialization in the processing of food and in growing parts of agricultural production. Sandeep already made this crucial difference between peasant agriculture and industrial agriculture. Now, peasant agriculture is relatively autonomous. Industrial agriculture is highly dependent on credit. It represents huge debts. Yeah, in countries like Brazil, for instance, this is shown even in an extreme way. Now, with the crisis, banks withdraw and do not want to refinance existing debt, so all this falls through this production. And finally, there is the phenomenon of precariousness, rural workers, peasant families, and also workers in the processing industries and slaughterhouses, for instance, live often in miserable conditions, have miserable working conditions, and this makes them extremely vulnerable for COVID. So the COVID fires us back on the system as a whole in this particular way. So here you have international food system showing a high degree of long distance trading, which is extremely vulnerable, a high degree of financialization, and a high level of precariousness, and all this show to be major weaknesses as soon as COVID-19 presented itself. And it's evident that exactly these key features are to be changed as soon as possible at the international level. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Yandawa. Thank you for that analysis, and we look forward to hearing more in the second round. For the moment, I would like to go now to Herman Kumara. Herman is joining us today from Sri Lanka, and he's the founder and national convener of the National Fisheries Solidarity Movement in Sri Lanka, as well as the former General Secretary of the World Forum of Fisher Peoples. Herman has been working for more than 30 years in the field of human rights with small-scale food producers of all kinds. He leads the land rights network Praha Abhilasha and the People's Alliance for Right to Land, and he sits on the executive committee of the South Asian Alliance for Poverty Eradication. Thank you very much for joining us today, Herman, and please go ahead. Herman, you are muted.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you, wherever you are. And I have a few slides to share with you about the fisheries sector, because I want to give some thoughts about the fisheries. And fisheries, fish provides more than 3.3 billion people with their per capita intake of animal proteins. It is important that 50% of them are from the low-income countries, SEEDs, and developing countries, vulnerable indigenous people. Importantly, they provide, the fish provide more than protein, because it provides minerals, vitamins, long chain of omega-3 fatty acids. Those are not coming from other animal proteins or from the plant protein. So the other important thing is their contribution to the local economies. It's 90% of men and women, the small scale fishers. They are living all over the world, And there are millions of people, fish processors, fish traders, fishers, transporters, and many other employed. So they represent from inland and as well as marine sectors. And of course, the lifestyles and rituals and daily practices surrounding fish consumption and fishing are deeply integrated into the cultures of the communities and their natural resources. So when you see the situations, so people, even pre-COVID, people are really, the fisher people are really excluded from the current situation, current system, from ecological externalities, because of some infrastructure development activities, exclusion from marine and coastal communities due to various development activities like protected areas, industrial zones, and also enforcement of maritime security issues. I will explain later. The inequitable access to the markets also it is very important. And this situation continue because of this situation introduced by the Rio Plus 20 about the blue economy. The blue economy means that how to exploit the resources in the sea more and more to gain profit. So it says the blue economy is sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improve livelihoods and jobs and ocean ecosystems. But this important thing is this blue economy will not really focus on the fishers who are depending on these resources heavily, more about the industries, about aquaculture, coastal tourism, bioeconomy, biotechnology, marine transportation, fish processing industries. So many that type of industries are taking place. So I would like to explain this into 4 categories. So for using these resources, using legal means like fishing by foreign vessels in our exclusive economic zones, promoting industrial aquaculture, fishing processes, maritime transportation, and also coastal development. It's about infrastructure development, tourism, port developments, industrial zones, and also marine extraction, oil and gas, seabed mining, of course with militarization, constructing fake islands, some canals, geopolitical military confrontation. So with these, people are marginalized. So because externalization of marginalized communities, especially coastal and marine communities, we have identified in some of their studies. And self-organized women fish vendors are being removed from the supply chain. And irreversible damage to coastal and marine ecosystem, such as estuaries and lagoons, mudflats, mangroves, so on and so forth. Trade and fiscal deficit leading to devaluation of currency and inflation, countries like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India, and so on. And displacement of people due to dispossession of resources and denial of their rights to ocean and coastal commons. We have experienced now in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, in Asian countries. At the same time, the militarization is also seriously affect our people, the coastal communities. Because of that, our people are really in danger. That is at the pre-COVID situation. But this situation further worsened with the COVID situation, because closures of harbors and fish markets and restriction of movements. One way it is transportation, other way fishers and fish workers, they cannot move, they cannot go to sea. So many restrictions on them, and women fish vendors and traders lost their livelihoods, and food insecurity in protected crisis. So many type of issues which face by the communities in this system, because the government in many of the countries, governments are not really focusing the issues of small scale fishers and the fish communities who are totally depending on these natural resources. So natural resources are being grabbed, because when we say about the blue economy means now we have already exploited our resources from the land. So we now go to the sea and we need to take the resources in the sea. So the whole idea came up with the one person called Gunther Pauli mentioned about how we get the sunken billions. So sunken billions mean how we exploit the resources in the sea. So that's the situation the fishers are facing. Because of that, we are mainly focusing on mega type of development, coastal industrial zones. And for an instance, we are working on some of the global geopolitics players like China and other countries. In my country, in Sri Lanka, we have constructed one of the fake islands, that is, we call Colombo International Financial City, which is one of the main investment of China. And also the coastal communities, their coastal beds, and also environment, coastal reefs, these all are being devastated. But the government doesn't want to listen to the people. They don't want to hear the people's voice. Because of this situation, people, they lost their land, they lost their resources, they lost their income, and eventually they push into poverty. So in this context, we are really involved to organize to assert our rights. So that is the situation that we are facing in Sri Lankan context.
Thank you, Herman. Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing those very important and interesting parallels between the situation facing people working the land and people working in the seas. So that's very, very valuable. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing more in the second round. And I would like now to introduce Dr. Laksmi Savitri. Laksmi is joining us from Indonesia, where she is the chairperson of the National Board of FIAN Indonesia. FIAN is a human rights organization devoted to the right to food and nutrition. Laksmi is also a member of the Indonesian Participatory Mapping Network and the Indonesian editor for the Initiatives in Critical Agrarian Studies. Laksmi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning for everyone. It's really glad to be here and share with you some thoughts and analysis of the challenges that faced by the right to food and nutrition, drawing much from the case of Indonesia, but of course, to some extent, it's also shared by very much situations of the world today. Of course, we all understand that the structural problems that we are facing today are not something new. We have been living from crisis to crisis for the last century, and it is created, among others, by our food system. But probably only today that the crisis culminates at a planetary level in the form of COVID-19 pandemic. Then the pandemic situation reveals to us and the governments around the world only two options: either to boost the economy as it was, and even with a faster growth due to the recession, or to go slow and transform. Unfortunately, the second option is not an option for the government of Indonesia and many other Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines or Thailand. Even the wave of authoritarian neoliberalism now hits people harder, and using the pandemic situation as a way to halt protests on the streets and restrict mobilization of people to protect their land from land grabbing mechanisms. In the case of Indonesia, this operation of authoritarian neoliberal government is also shown by a more intense coalition between the military, corporate owners, and right-wing Islamists who place their operatives in the political party to access a seat in presidential cabinet. And through corrupted election process, it also eventually influences the composition of people representatives, and now 45% of the parliament members are also corporate owners. In short, the oligarchic structure dominates the executive and legislative positions and backed up by the old generals mafia and their power to mobilize paramilitary groups. This constellation of power is resulting into productions of regulations on food and agriculture that legitimize what used to be illegal, such as land banking by the state, free tax for large-scale land investment, free access of GMO seeds and imported seeds, eliminations of compliance to environmental impact assessment, and so forth and so on. So in a sense, what happened today as challenges to the realizations of the right to food and nutrition, which I think is not Indonesia specific, but also happened in many global South countries, can be clustered into two problems. The first, clustered in the state-led food and agricultural market liberalization. Under this problematic step of government responses to the threat of food crisis in the pandemic situation, there are many aspects unfolding. First, the food policy is actually really just a matter of stock balancing and balance of trade, without any perspective of rights and justice. And this gives effect to widen class-defined access to food and nutrition, which indicates by corporate capture on food, serious hunger status indicates by high number of malnutrition, stunting, wasting, and COVID-19 starvation cases. And this is also strengthened by the fact that no systematic food aid programs for the poor or effective distribution of input subsidies for farmers. Only cash transfer based on a very poor data about who the marginal groups are actually. And other thing is the taking away of staple food production from small-scale farmers and transform it into a large-scale agro-industrial estate operation, as mentioned by Sandeep before, which is going to be for the first time in Indonesia, and with aim for a direct integration with corporate-owned industrial food processing. And it is demonstrated by the designation of food estate project as a strategic national project, followed by a full-blown of corporatizations of farmers and other food producers' production and distribution system via new regulations. And the other also is the global value chain effect to smallholders producing for export, as shown by sharp price fall due to long supply chain, transport restriction in pandemic situation, low market absorption, and oversupply, which lead farmers into deeper debt trap. And there is also a new regulation for freeing the trade of certified seeds, opening a wide access for import and GMO seeds, which resulting into small-scale food producers, criminalization, inaccessible cost of certification, unaffordable production costs, reduced income, poverty trap, and on the other hand, non-food consumption is increasing, like the price of electricity, sanitary needs due to the pandemic situation, internet credit, because everything should be going online. And the second cluster of the problem is the militarization of food production. As the pandemic effect leads to food crisis, the problem is tackled by expanding agricultural land via large-scale land acquisition, including in the peatland areas, ignoring a great risk of forest fire and climate catastrophe. To anticipate protests on the ground, food production sector was given to military institutions to lead, especially to control large-scale farms operation, including assignment of military personnel for civilian control in each food-producing village in many parts of Indonesia. It is said that the investors from Middle East and China have taken interest to this food security proposal from Indonesia. So overall, taking lessons from Indonesia, what we see in the global agricultural crisis is a crisis that is created long ago by our own food system. And it has driven faster by the pandemic situation, which showing us the real game, which is who can extract the most benefit from the situation. But of course, we can only answer this by taking into account diverse projects of alternatives coming from various movements around the globe, including from Indonesia, which I will talk about later. And I will stop here. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Laksmi, and thank you to all our panelists so far. I think you've provided together a very compelling and interesting analysis of the challenges that we're facing today, of the situation that we're in today, and how we got ourselves here. I'm hoping that in the second round, we can turn, as Laksmi has already indicated, towards the question of the solutions that are being proposed and the ways forward that we see. So to the question of what is to be done. So I would like to turn, as I said, we'll return to the same panelists in the same order and give them just 5 minutes for that enormous question. So I'd like to start with Sandeep, please.
I wish I were that articulate, but thank you. I'll try to, Katie, and forgive me, friends who are listening in, for being somewhat incoherent in terms of the pressure of time. It's like entering a cooking competition with 5 minutes and trying to cook a full 3-course meal. But anyway, be as it may, let me just say the follows. I think the future of any socialist thinking, egalitarian, advanced, whichever language you choose, just an equal world, needless to say, and our politics would tell you, lies in the hands of people who are oppressed, lies in the hands of people who suffer the most, lies in the hand of people who I just call precarious, the everywhere, nowhere people. And I think it's in this regard, this analysis needs to be propelled by all of us. And of course, we need to be part of those struggles and processes. And I see lots of hopes in resistances of indigenous people against the theft of land, against the theft of forest, in the resistances of informal and workers' strikes around the world, in the resistances that women have launched, the feminist struggles have launched. I think it's at that axis of race, caste, indigeneity, and informal work, I beg to add here, because we have to understand that in this century, in the second decade of this century, the historic question of a separation between who's a peasant and who's a worker has become largely infructuous. The people that I spoke about, the 3 billion or so people, roughly are people who in one part of their year are peasants, usually landless agricultural workers, and another part of the year are workers in fact, not in factories, but in head loading, in construction, in brick kilns. There's a range of occupations in domestic work, and women whose work is rarely ever valued, actually nowhere. Unpaid, unequal, underpaid, you can add all kind of adjectives to it. So it's at that constellation and that coming together of people's formations that I think a socialist future needs to be built around in those hands. So I want to make this general point, and in the context of our different countries, there are significant defragmentations that are needed. There are significant fragmentations along work lines, because the nature of the work itself has changed. The type of economy itself has changed. Home-based work, outsourced work, gig work, platform workers. So I think one needs to be part of reimagining how these constellations come together, and these are contextually varied. So there's no one mega formula. I mean, this is a kind of a theoretical context, but in each geographic context, who and how, with what agency and what primacy is already happening. And I think we all need to be part of that process to encourage it. So that's one general point I wish to make. The second point I wish to make in a very, very quick manner is a point I sort of raised. Friends, we are in a phase of almost what is called the second, third generation assault on peasant agricultures by the way of what's called the green revolutions. So we saw the first wave of green revolutions in the 70s. India and the state of Punjab, which Farooq Bhai knows, was at the front end of that experiment called the Green Revolution, built around commodification of agriculture, built around the idea of surplus production and accumulation in agriculture, ostensibly to solve the food crisis which prevailed in that world, with the assumption that peasant agricultures can never supply the hungry millions of the world, an assumption which is scientifically and historically proved wrong on axis of food sovereignty, on axis of food security, on several other axes, including those of productions. For one can argue with historic data that tropical and subtropical agricultures in the peasant manner are equally and in fact more productive under the circumstances. And I think I won't have time to get into that numbers arguments, but they have been made. We are at the second stage of that revolution. Professor Herman Kumara talked about the blue revolution. Yeah, you talked about the blue context. We in India have seen, and Pakistan, I think you have seen what's called the white revolution, the dairy revolution. So some years ago, the last Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, or the one before, talked of the second green revolutions in the continent of Africa, and this is really worrying. We can imagine a second assault of capital on agriculture by the way of the same logic of green revolution, which created in today's Punjab a huge ecological distress, salinity in soil, complete failures of agriculture, inability to even farm, and dependent psychological crisis. Drug addiction rates in the Indian Punjab are really, really high on account of the disaster called agriculture in the last 2.5, 3, 4 decades since the first wave of the Green Revolution. So we all know this model of agriculture will lead to that future. Consolidated agriculture in the hands of capital, in the hands of industry, by the way of plantation agriculture, is reminiscent of colonial plantation agricultural setups. So in some ways, agriculture completely needs to be decolonized. That's the second point I want to make. Otherwise, you are bound to have, on the one hand, billions of people jobless in the informal economy, precarious under every conceivable situation, and on the other hand, a consolidated set of farming only meant for production of food. So I think that's the second point. My third point, therefore, the trajectories, and I'll end pretty quickly, Katie, the trajectories of the unsettled issues need to be resolved first. The unsettled issue of land and control over land, the historic questions of landlessness, the right of land, the land to the tiller is not a dead subject matter of history. It's not a question buried in sands of time. It needs to live again. The question of protection of lands from being stolen, what is called in the African continent land grabs, and what's called in Asia more politely land acquisitions, needs to be stalled by all kinds of resistances, whether it's the waters, Dr. Herman, or whether it's the right of traditional fishers over water and fishing, or whether it's the right of tillers over land. It needs to be defended. Agriculture needs to be defended. So therefore, the idea that agrarian land should not be transformed to non-agrarian purposes should be defended. That's the second point I quickly wish to make. The third point I wish to make is in terms of the idea of prices for food. And I think we should have a webinar on this because it's a fairly detailed subject matter. We know of dumping from the north into the south, which continues now in a different way, in an idea called the global value chains, which Laksmi Savitri pointed to, and I'll come to that. But essentially, we need to ensure that producers, small producers, peasant producers, get the farm gate prices, get protected, dignified prices, not on the whims and fancies of urban consumers, but basis of their dignity and basis of their futures. And I think this is a debate which needs to happen in a much more substantiated way. For in every instance, farmers are at the receiving end. I am talking in the context of my country, but it's generalizable. And it is in this regard, the idea of farming, how do you defend farming? The idea of farming collectives, women coming together to advance collectivized agriculture, cooperativized agriculture is not again a dead idea. Its time has come. Its time is needed to come, and I think we need to defend that. And lastly, I would say peasant agricultures also do need modernization. By modernization, I don't mean shift of autonomy and control to corporates. By modernization, I mean simply removal of drudgery for women, for many others in peasant farming, for men in peasant farming, but within their control. So introduction of technology under the control of the peasants, under the control of the farmers, under local sovereignty and control is an important unaddressed question. So we can't just romanticize peasant agricultures as something which is continued for centuries and will continue with that same level of drudgery, with the same level of internal exploitation. That also needs a reform. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. Thank you for those excellent points. I'd like to pass, please, to Yandawa.
Thank you, Katie. Well, I will indicate 4, I think, major ingredients of a solution. The first ingredient is to fight and to redress industrial agriculture. That is, support and strengthen and generalize peasant agriculture as much as possible. This point has already been brought forward by Sandeep as well. I think it's important to underline why we need peasant agriculture. Peasant agriculture represents autonomy. Peasant agriculture is grounded on the use of ecological capital, on living nature, on locally available resources. And key in it is peasant labor, peasant labor transforms the available resources in food. This is not very much dependent on external inputs, on external energy, and this makes peasant agriculture resilient. It makes peasant agriculture an important key factor in mitigation of climate crisis. So the world needs peasant agriculture, the more so since it's not very much dependent on financial capital. Yeah, debts, credit are not crucial. So also in this respect, it is resilient. A second ingredient is linked to this. We need to construct peasant markets far more than there already are. That is markets that offer peasant producers a direct outlet for their produce and link them directly with urban consumers. This can even make for important coalitions between the urban and the rural people. Third ingredient is the need to construct new small and medium enterprises for food processing. Currently, the processing of food is controlled by large capital groups, food empires that exert an enormous power. In nearly no part of the economy, monopolization is as high as in food processing. This needs to be altered drastically. And of course, these new small and medium enterprise is to be cooperative, is to be controlled by workers and by peasants and consumers alike. Yeah, and they are to be linked again closely to peasant markets. And the final point is that we need urgently, also in the aftermath of COVID-19, we need all over the world national policies for food sovereignty. Then the world can never become so dependent on international flows of food, flows controlled by capital, flows that fall flat whenever a problem emerges. We need food sovereignty, and in order to provide this, we need national policies that outline and implement such a food sovereignty. I will stop here, Katie, in order to give room to my other friends in the panel.
Thank you very much, Yandawa. Thank you for that concise summary of some huge strategies. And indeed, any time that we have left at the end, we will come back for questions. So great to have a bit of breathing room. I will pass now to Herman Kumara.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I think the whole question of food production and exchange and the value chain system should be taken to the hands of the social movements, and they should address this issue in the context of food sovereignty. The whole question of the food production and consumption by the poor and marginalized communities are really in danger at present, because all the big markets are open, but not the small food market, food production in the form of small markets are not really open, and they are not really allowed to open. So that way, the small producers are really cut off from the production and marketing system. So that social movement should take this up. And in Sri Lanka, in our context, that we are taking this up, and we are talking about one particular aspect, how we want to move forward in the post-COVID situation. So we have identified certain basic features of post-COVID situation. We have prepared some. We are in a dialogue, and we are continuing in a dialogue in that direction, and also we are starting to do certain things with the small groups, small communities, farmers, and fishers. So that is one way that we want to address this situation and go forward. The second, we need to address actually together with the social movements and indigenous people and people who are really depending on the natural resources, should take the climate crisis very seriously, because this is one of the worst situations, because the food producers, one side we are losing our crops because of the rainy seasons and drought seasons are changing, Other side, that fishers and fish communities are affected with cyclones, gales, and many type of disasters in the sea. So there should be some sort of very serious attention and intervention by the social movements, the groups involved in this process to remedy this situation. The third point I want to highlight here is that there should be a kind of framework. Though there are so many frameworks, so many government policies, the Food and Agriculture Organization and many other food organizations are already adopted, but they are not really practicing what are the really necessary things. I mean, the valuable, important things are not really being implemented. So we need to come forward and say these, what you agreed, you should respect, you should implement in your countries. Like, for an instance, the guidelines of small-scale fisheries, it is not being discussed in Sri Lanka at all. So that is one of the important measures that the World Forum Fisher People, the social movement, the fisher movements are taking up in the world. But they are not really taking care of that, and they are not really ready to implement that. There are several important aspects are there. So we need to take them up and push forward as social movement to implement. At the same time, as fishers, we were involved in the past to adopt this safety at sea measures that protect the small fishers when they engage in fishing activities in the sea with various type of climate and other type of disasters. So those things are not really being adopted and making policies and not being implemented. So those things should be taken care of and pushed forward by the people themselves who are really depending on those matters, those resources. That is one thing that I want to share at this moment. Katie, I have another 5 questions. Maybe we can go to the next step when we having the question and answer session, because I have 5 questions already addressed directly to me. So maybe I can go. Farooq, I think we can go to those questions next. Is that correct? Or should I?
So yeah, we will go now to Laksmi, if that's all right, for her second intervention, and then indeed Farooq will take up some of the questions. So we probably, as I said at the beginning, won't manage to answer each question. You can also, Herman, if you are inclined and have a moment, you can also type answers to some quite specific questions, and we'll come back to some of the more like general conceptual ones in the Q&A round in a moment. So now to Laksmi.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. I will take some examples of what has already happening on the ground. The disappointment towards corporate cost capture in food systems that especially revealed during the pandemic leads to the emergence of women leaders in food movement. Many women lead a collective farm to plant local food and spread the initiatives beyond their geographic reach. And also there is an emergence of youth movement for food sovereignty through art and culture, back to the village, back to the farm movement, initiated especially by indigenous people movement and youth organizations for food sovereignty. And the pandemic situation also reveals the importance of localized food system, and it triggers many initiatives for community-supported agriculture, farmers, workers, co-op, and also there is a proliferation of nested markets built by food producers, healthy food literate consumers for healthy natural food and food processing. And in many parts of Indonesia, there is also the declarations of food sovereign agroecological regions declared by Indonesia Peasant Union. And there is an increase of literacy of healthy food, which has attracted urban consumers to become also food growers, including urban poor who used to have income from informal sector and now shift into urban farming activity and become vegetable sellers. So in short, and this is going to be very short, my intervention, the transition into just and resilient food system is clearly initiated from below by the people who severely impacted by the crisis. Many governments are very slow or not responding at all to these many initiatives, while in the same time signing new bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements, signaling that their reluctance to respond to the proposal of food system reform. For instance, next week, the government of Indonesia organized a Jakarta Food Security Summit involving almost all presidential institutions and corporate owners without any presence of people representatives. So this confirmed that what needed is a global movement to structurally change the working of intergovernmental agreements and mechanisms to take into justice the violation of people's rights to have adequate, safe, and nutritious food. While in parallel, we should try to multiply and organize the practice of commoning and also agroecology. And that's what I can share about right now. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Laksmi, for that intervention. And with our remaining time, we've actually won a few minutes by being very rigorous and strict with our timekeeping. So very many thanks to everyone for that. I will now pass to Farouk Tariq to ask some questions from the audience, and he will come back to all of you to give you an opportunity to respond to those questions.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, speakers. It was very good presentation by all our speakers, and that is manifested by over a dozen questions, which I don't know if we are able to reply those. So, Sandeep, there is a question about sustainable food supply, how we can achieve that. And also linked with that is a social security and social protection for the farmers affected by COVID-19. So if you could take up these two questions, I will go further on issue of food solidarity, on liberalization of the sector, which maybe Herman Kumara can take up, and also the issue of climate justice. Maybe Professor John can take that. And there are a few more questions. So Sandeep, if you could take up issue of sustainable food supplies. Sustainable food supplies, issue of social security and social protection for those affected by COVID-19.
So first of all, I think there's this growing idea, and I think it needs to become a momentum on the idea, and this will address many of the issues raised in the question box. I think not all, obviously, because this world is very diverse, our ecosystems are very diverse, solutions are diverse, people are diverse, but this idea of ecological valuation of services and of farming, I think is fundamental to what you say. So by ecological valuation, we mean as a society, and obviously reflected in the state policies, if we were to say that any farming done in an ecological value will have greater social value and greater economic value, then obviously you are moving the trajectory towards a different nature. So both in terms of encouraging sustainable food supply, that was your specific question, Farooq ji. Thank you for this opportunity, to you in particular, and of course to Katie and other colleagues who put it together. So I think that's one fundamental direction. Now this transacts also in the urban world. Let me give you an example. Let's say the rag pickers in our cities. What do? They actually are people who, or sanitation workers in our cities. They are actually people who clean the cities, make the cities green and livable to an extent. And it is in that sense, their jobs need to be valued as somebody who are doing a planetary service. And that's what I mean by the idea behind ecological valuation. The same applies to indigenous people's farming, the way they farm. Unfortunately, that has been looked down upon, castigated, and pushed to the peripheries. So that's what I meant by the idea of decolonizing our thinking with reference to what's needed by the planet and what's needed by the people of this planet. So point number one. Point number two, with reference to your second question, that what should be the offset to farmers during the time of COVID. Now, what's really happened, particularly for countries in the south, we have seen immense reverse migration, which has meant a lot of what is called precarious informal workers who were finding some job in the cities have now nothing. So they've landed back into the refuge that they always had, and which is, I think, the final refuge of the world in any case. And that is where the competition and contestation for whatever little fragments were there has become so very intense. So at the outset, this means a complete revamping of the idea of creating employment in agrarian sector by actually doing something in the way Keynes would have, what is called employment generation, countryside employment generation programs to restore nature, to restore water commons, to restore pasture lands, and the state to undertake to pay those services, because those are ecological futures, rebuilding the ecological futures in the countryside, likewise in the urban area. So that's one point. Second point is to promote what Professor Jan already mentioned, and what I hinted to as well, a rural enterprise in a collectivized manner, call it cooperatives, call it labor collectives, which are farming linked and non-farming linked as well, but which are under the control of the workers and the reverse migrants and the landless people therein. Third, this is the time to undertake the unfinished agenda of land reforms in the countryside. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, landless workers, so they need to resolve this question, and which is what, so this general direction we have to do, apart from the state providing one-off emergency support till the time economy comes. Very quickly, the last point, and this means political agency. If you want to see change, which is a colleague who mentioned in the chat box, in the comment box, the point is there are two instruments available. The instrument of social movements, which is close to people, but far more important in today's day and age, in the last 50 years to the last 70 years, is the ascendancy of the instrument of political parties. Therefore, the peasantry, the workers, having an intervention in what is called the political system, in the power system, which is occupied and hegemonized at the moment on social change and policy making axis by the political parties, is a must. So the idea of workers' parties, I know you lead one such party, Farooqji. So I am not deferring to your party, but the idea whose time has come, the parties of workers, the parties of peasant and workers, the parties of women, and I think that constellation needs to happen. So I'll stop here. Sorry, I have a lot more to say, but we rest it now, and I think we take it up in another context. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. I know that there's a lot to say, but I will now go to Herman Kumara. There's a specific question to him about the need of food solidarity between the fisher folk and the farmers, and also the market liberalization in Sri Lanka and others, and how is that affecting the farmers community. So Hermanji.
Yes, you know, there was a very remarkable detail in the first days after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was that authorities throughout Europe tried to forbid the phenomenon of popular market, peasant market, or as Laksmi called it, nested markets, you know, where people interact directly, where fishermen, where peasants bring the produce to the market and people buy it immediately. For the authorities, these markets represent confusion, chaos. That they are the opposite of control. They said, well, everybody goes to the supermarket, that is safe, that is hygienic, and the popular markets are to be avoided. This provoked a huge protest in Italy and Spain and the Netherlands, in Germany, and also in Brazil and other parts. And people said, well, if there is not, we can as citizens, we can take responsibility and behave in a very responsible way. And thus we can secure ourselves the social protection for those who come to the markets. If there is not space enough, then we enlarge, we occupy the neighboring streets, and we enter with the market there so that we have more space available. You see, the responsibility of people here who composed, as it were, a movement to protect and to enlarge these markets. As a matter of fact, and this is a very telling detail, the sales of peasant markets and peasant shops rose with 60 to 70% in the first weeks after the pandemic. Everybody knew, hey, that's a safe place to go. That is where safe food is offered. So the markets themselves became a kind of important counterpoint in the struggles. And this, as I said, this is about fishermen, it's about food producers, peasants. Yeah, they both play a role in it. And it shows also how movements currently counteract the principle of capital and the principle of control, so tightly associated with the notion of capital. Capital wants to have it all under control, but as a counter movement, people take their own responsibility, create their own room, and create social protection. And then the last point I want to observe following your questions and remarks. Yes, COVID struck very hard in the countryside, but you know where? In the very large agricultural enterprises, capitalist enterprises,
Absolutely.
where thousands of workers are together in conditions of precariousness, migrant workers from all over the place, and national workers, doesn't matter, but precariousness was the common denominator, and there was no such massive outbreak in the peasant sectors of the economy. Well, that's also very telling detail I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Yes, that is true, Professor Yan. Same is true in Pakistan, where the countryside is safe from corona, but most of the congested area of the city are now facing the second wave of pandemic. So, Herman, can you take up the issue of food solidarity between farmers and fisher folk? Because some people try to divide the two. They are part of the same chain, but how would you explain that solidarity between farmers and fishermen?
Thank you, Farooqji. This one of Indian writer, the prominent writer Arundhati Roy has mentioned one thing. She has written in one of the articles saying that this pandemic clearly showed the shortcomings of the neoliberal economic system. It is not break down it, but it clearly exposed the situation. So, the previously it was highly recognized and highly accepted, everyone saying that, okay, neoliberal economic situation make it global village. But our experience, in our case, the farmers who produce vegetables, onions, and many other food crops, they were unable to transport their food to the places where they were transported earlier. They were not able to sell their production, and it was rotted in their own places and in the markets and so on. So the system was not allowed to people to transport their food, and also the same way the fishers were not able to bring them to the places where they were sent them earlier. So the COVID caused a lot of disturbances. So after this, you cannot say it's a global market or global village or whatever that you call it. So in this context, actually, what we did and what we are experiencing right now is that there is the necessities emerging to have kind of exchanges between the farmers and the fishers and other consumers. So we are now trying to develop certain system, but still not come to a reality. But it is a reality. I mean, it could be done. It's not a myth. So it could be done. So this the people who really produce fish can exchange with the vegetable producers. The
Absolutely.
vegetable producers that can exchange those food with the fish producers. So in that way, this system can be developed. So this solidarity will be developed. So in that way only we can make sure that the food producers can work together hand in hand, and we realize that the same corporates are exploiting us and devastating the devastate the environment and dispossess the resources from the people who are really depending on them. So in that understanding, with that understanding only we can work together. If we really analyze that situation and get people more and more knowledgeable about that, then people work together. In that context, we can have better understanding, better exchanges, better learning from us. So that is very much possible.
Thank you, Herman ji. Now I will come to Laksmi ji. But before, I want to say that there will be one more round of questions to all of you, because there are many questions coming up. But Lakshmi ji, I just like to tell you, last few days there is demonstrations of communities going on near Lahore, where I'm based in Pakistan, by those whose homes and land has been taken over by the state to build a new city called River Ravi City. So they want to build a massive city around the river and try to make big malls and so on. And I heard them, these communities, saying they were crying and weeping, say, how could we leave our home? We have built it by working hours and hours, and now you want to throw us away. We don't want to be relocated. We don't want to leave our home. So can you take up to this question of rolling back of land and water and regeneration of the communities, which is a phenomena taking over most of the Asian cities, where a lot of land grab and water grab is going on?
Mhm. Yes. Well, it's happening all over the world, and also this idea of having a new capital city in Indonesia also takes that kind of problem as well. But I think I will also link this with the questions of why it is important to going back to the farm and going back to the village, because in that situation, we are facing a generation problem nowadays in agriculture, and agriculture is full of old people, and then because young people are going out, looking for a job in the cities, but in fact the cities are taking their land from them. So I think the importance is how to prevent that kind of situations by taking back the young generations to their village and to the farms, and looking into a better future for agriculture in the village. And that means the modernizations of the village or rural areas with technology or infrastructure needed by the young generations to become a fully profitable peasant in that sense. And that's why the questions of where is the young generation today is very important, because if there is no youth in the village or on the land, and it makes difficult the work of organizing. And on the other side of the coin also, because of they are not tilling the land, so their parents, their older generation thought that it's better to sell it because probably money taking from the land selling is more promising than working in agriculture.
Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah.
Go on.
No, it's okay. I'm finished.
Okay, now we cannot really take up all the questions, but I would ask Sandeep. There are questions on the issue of for the landless peasantry, and Sandeep, you spoke about land reforms, the importance of land reforms, And I can tell the Pakistan experience is the land reforms are declared by the courts as un-Islamic. You cannot distribute the land because this is like what is given to you by the God. So there is a question by our friend from Malaysia who is asking how can we ensure job security for landless peasantry? Sandeep?
There are in different policies many dimensions to this story. So fundamentally, the unfinished agenda of land reforms is a political question. So yes, sometimes religion is used as a front to keep the feudal interest and interest of capital alive. But that aside, so this explains the reason why it is called unreligious or whatever else,
Un-Islamic.
or anti-national or unconstitutional. It can be called by various epithets, but that fundamentally hides. That's the conflict of interest that it speaks to. But having said it, your more important question is what therefore needs to be done to ensure job security. So one kind of policies that I have seen is anti-eviction policies. So anybody who's a cropper in the land or has role in production, even as a tenant or sharecropper, I have seen in some countries policies which say that they cannot thus be evicted. If I am doing cropping for somebody else as a tenant farmer, then I get a protection from the state for a lock-in period that I can't be evicted from that tenure, so to say. This has been followed in India. So, and after 10 to 11 years, this is on paper, and in practice, many different things can happen, but that needs to be enforced. So after 10 or 11 years, I get even the parcel of land. So that's one kind of policy. Second is to have the land ceilings. You see, many of our countries have always had some idea of a land ceiling in order to propel the idea of redistribution of land, given that it is a fixed commodity. And no longer a fixed commodity because newer lands are brought under agriculture. Sea can be reclaimed back, and we can contest all these things. But having said it, the idea of land ceilings needs to be revised because a lot has happened with irrigation. A lot has happened with agricultural production systems in the last 50 years, after the land ceiling acts were made. So definitely the land ceilings need to be lowered down so that land is available for redistribution. Thirdly, and I forgot to mention earlier, we have to have national policies to defend the commons. The commons such as the pasture lands on which depend pastoralists, on which depend a lot of our commons, commons such as the forests and the waters, which are increasingly being submitted to commodification. In terms of defending agricultural workers, movements in India have long been propelling the idea of an agricultural workers social safety net and security act, therefore enabling a policy space and a protection with reference to social protection for all landless agricultural workers, not just by the way of transfer of social protection resources, but also by the way of labor rights and rights of workers occupied thus.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Thank you.
the top line stuff, but there are details available. Should any of you who are on this call, friends, be interested, I shall be happy on behalf of our journal, the Agrarian South, but also on behalf of my organization, Actionaid Association, to submit the various collections of various experiments and various trajectories of different countries that we have done. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will now ask John, who spoke about the national policies, importance of national policies on food sovereignty. But there are questions also about livelihood coping mechanism by vulnerable farmers. And can you take up the issue of food sovereignty, which is now part of the constitution in Nepal and which is part of the Peasant Charter, UN Peasant Charter approved by the General Assembly, which is taking roots in different communities across the globe. Food sovereignty instead of food security is becoming more popular. Can you take up that question, please?
Yeah, it's nice that you refer to the Peasant Charter that has been accepted by the United Nations, that you refer to Nepal, and we could mention countries like Bolivia and Ecuador and other
Yes.
countries who integrated the principle of food sovereignty in their constitutions. I mean, this is from a point of view of emancipation, are very interesting developments. These are humanitarian considerations that regard society as a whole and that are making progress. It shows that the peasant agriculture and the capability of peasant agriculture to provide good food to the nation, but at the same time take care for the landscapes, for biodiversity, for the climate, to generate employment, to socialize the youth, the young people, that all this is part of our civilization, and it's recognized again after the many attacks that we have witnessed over the last decades, the Green Revolution. It has already been mentioned, saying, well, this is all just stagnating economy, this peasant agriculture. They talked about the backwardness, they talked about I don't know what. We are now in an epoch in which the world recognizes again the importance of the peasant principle. And when talking about the peasant principle, I understand it in a very wide sense, also including fisher folk and independent people working in the urban economy. It's about people having their own resource base, their self-controlled resource base, operating in an autonomous way, being an expression of true citizenship. It's about democracy in the economic dimension, not just limited to the political dimension, let alone to elections, but it's a wider principle. And this, we see this marching ahead, and that's a good sign. And now, well, it's indeed very urgent that we take the lessons from this bitter COVID-19 pandemic in order to reorganize our societies and to make for a more just world, both in the north and in the south. Thank you, Farooq.
Thank you. Before I come to Hermanji, I just like to say that one of our leading activists in Pakistan, Khabar Mumtaz, who is head of Women Commission, she has just raised an issue of linking food sovereignty with the land rights, with the ownership of land, which we totally agree with her. Now, Hermanji, there are several questions on sustainable agriculture practices. And when Katie and Sarajan and Kathy and several others were in Pakistan, beginning of this year in February, they have seen some practical side of natural sustainable crop system, where no use of fertilizer, no pesticides, more mulching of the land on the beds, and it is giving tremendous results. So less input, more output. So, and several questions has come up about the practices of natural sustainable crop system. So what would you say, Hermanji, on this?
Yeah, I'm not expert on agriculture sector, but I know that this is really the issue. And I saw Comrade Said also raised similar question about that direction. Why the food producers are in hungry and poverty. So that is the question. So I think the system that we are following in this food production is mainly more input, and we provide a lot of inputs for food production, and finally we cannot get income through that, and we are totally under indebtedness because of we are not covering the expenses or the inputs. So that is the situation wherever we are in food production systems in Asia or anywhere else. So that is only corporates are getting profit out of agriculture. Not the real producers are getting the income, at least for their survival, even for the subsidy. So in that context, I agree that the system must be totally changed. I mean, the way that we are going for food production, even the farmers are running behind more and more production, the growth, more growth-oriented development. So in that context, we use a lot of inputs, but finally we are not getting real income. So our mentality, the way that we think as farmers, also we need to totally revise or rechange. Without that, you cannot go that, because we all are producing to the market, but market will not help us. So the market is always exploit us, and with that we are not really getting income. So we are becoming poor and day by day. So that is the that's what I am seeing as a consumer of food.
Okay. Just I'd like to say, the last 4 days there were 2 peasants killed in Lahore by police when they came to attend a protest rally demanding better prices for wheat. Wheat is in shortage in Pakistan. It has been imported, but the government is still giving them very less price for 40 kg. When farmers came to Lahore, there was chemical polluted water thrown on them. Chemical is not even used during the war, but here in Lahore, chemical water was used. And while this webinar was going on, I received 8 farmer leaders, who came and sat down with us, and they told us the stories how they were treated by the police in Lahore. So I like to sort of present a resolution condemning this police action, solidarity with the farmers, and extending full support by Asia Europe People's Forum and all the organizations who are attending this webinar. Is that okay for everyone? Can we raise that? Okay, thank you. So the last question we would ask from Lakshmi is about communities going about getting training for things like seed and food cooperatives. So can you speak about something about seed and food cooperatives?
Okay. Thank you, Farooq. Yeah, in the case of Indonesia, I think there are many initiatives to build some seed co-op, trying to protect local seeds and then trying to collect it and based on what people already planted and already found in their farms. And they come together, pull this into a cooperative and exchange the seeds because otherwise they have to buy it or use the already used seeds for many times. So I think about training, I'm not sure where it can come for the training, but I think from learning of many examples that around the world about the seed co-op, and there are many seed co-ops in the global South countries and initiated by farmers as well. And the other one is about what, Farooq?
About food cooperatives.
Food cooperatives.
Yes.
Yeah, I think also the interesting thing is about the community-supported agriculture, and this leads into a food cooperative also, the integration with food cooperatives, because most of the in this sense the community, what we mean by community is the food producers. I mean the culinary food producers as well. So that's very interesting to see these integrations of community and food producers as well.
Okay, thank you. I will ask my colleague Katie to wrap up the whole discussion, to sum up the discussions, and also to announce the next webinar of Asia Europe People's Forum Food Cluster webinar. Katie?
Thank you very much, Farooq. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us for these great discussions and for sharing these many different, but I think really complementary perspectives. And thank you as well for bearing with us for a few extra moments so that we could get through as many of the questions as possible from the question and answer. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience and to our AEPF communications team who supported throughout this, as well as thank you very much to our interpreters. And I hope we haven't all been talking much too fast, but I'm sure we have. But thank you very much for the interpretation to Urdu and to Bahasa. And as for Rook mentioned, this webinar is the first in a two-part series organized by our Food Sovereignty and Resource Justice Cluster. The next will take place on the 24th of November, so in just 2 weeks' time. And that will take up in more detail the question of land struggles. And we will be having an exchange of strategies from activists working in locally based land struggles in Europe and in Asia. And as you registered for today's webinar, you should receive some information about how you can register for the next one in 2 weeks' time. And you can find it also on the AEPF website and social media. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for the discussion, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks' time.